I grew up in a modest house on the outskirts of a city that never slept. My earliest memories revolve around the gentle hum of the kitchen fan, late-night phone calls, and my parents' hushed arguments about money. Even as a child, I sensed that finances were a delicate topic. My mother would sigh, my father would pace, and I'd hide behind the chipped living room door, trying not to be seen. Yet something in their tone told me we were always one bill away from chaos. I became obsessed with the idea of stability. If I had the power to earn money, I believed I could shield everyone from fear. My parents, though loving, seemed to carry a silent expectation that I, the oldest child, would somehow fix everything. I didn't complain. Instead, I studied hard and worked part-time jobs from the moment I could. Whether it was mowing lawns in the neighborhood or babysitting on weekends, I hustled to earn extra cash. By the time I graduated high school, my family had grown dependent on me. They'd ask for loan after loan, and I rarely said no. Deep down, I believed it was my duty. After all, family came first. When I entered college, I juggled multiple part-time jobs to cover tuition and living expenses. I was tired, but the exhaustion felt necessary. I was determined to climb out of our family's cycle of financial uncertainty. Even though I received a few scholarships, the money only went so far, and my parents couldn't contribute much. In fact, they often tapped into my earnings themselves. The calls asking for money became more frequent. My father needed a car repair. My mother needed help paying the electric bill. My younger sister needed new clothes for her dance competitions. I always found a way to say yes, rearranging my schedule or cutting back on my own necessities. Sometimes, it meant eating instant noodles for weeks on end just to make sure I could send cash home. Friends would comment on my constant stress, but I shrugged it off. In my mind, I was doing the right thing. A family is supposed to be a support system, and, at the time, I believed support meant giving money whenever it was requested. I was too naive to see the pattern forming. The more I gave, the more they asked, and the more I felt obligated to provide. Graduation came with both joy and a sense of apprehension. I landed a decent entry-level job in the city, which felt like a massive step forward for me. I was excited to finally have a steady income, envisioning how I'd pay off my student loans and maybe even move into a better place. My childhood dream of achieving stability seemed within reach. But it didn't take long for my family's demands to follow me into this new chapter. A few weeks after I started working, my mother called in tears, explaining that a leak in the bathroom had caused severe water damage. A few days later, my sister called to say she'd maxed out her credit card. Even my aunt chimed in about her unexpected medical bills. I told myself this was all temporary. They're just going through a rough patch, I repeated like a mantra. After all, I'd made it my life's mission to protect them from hardship. My own finances took a hit, and before I knew it, my paychecks were almost entirely eaten up by other people's problems. I felt drained yet guilty whenever I considered saying no. I saw myself as their savior, and possibly their only hope. My first performance review at work was mixed. My supervisor noted my strong work ethic but hinted that I appeared distracted. It was true. Half the time, I was juggling urgent texts and phone calls from relatives who needed money or had crises that somehow fell on my shoulders. In meetings, I found myself mentally calculating how much I could spare from my next paycheck to help them. I knew I needed better boundaries, but how could I set them? These were the people I loved, the ones I grew up with. It felt like betrayal to turn them away. And in my mind, I still clung to the belief that if I worked just a bit harder, I could afford to help everyone. That was the trap. Every time I told myself it was temporary, a new emergency came up. I'd vow that this would be the last time. But sure enough, another desperate phone call arrived, and I'd cave again. My bank account balance routinely dipped near zero just days after payday. I started to wonder why no one else was stepping in. Why was I the sole provider? Yet each time I raised this concern, they'd remind me I was the most capable one. When I finally got a small raise, I briefly celebrated. Then, almost immediately, my uncle called. He had lost his job and needed help with rent. Even though I barely knew him, I said yes. I didn't even hesitate. It was just automatic. Afterward, I felt a twinge of resentment but quickly buried it. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning whether I was being a good person or just a gullible one. The next morning, I treated myself to a coffee on the way to work, something I usually avoided to save money. Guilt gnawed at me even over that small indulgence. As I sipped the coffee, it struck me how bizarre it was to feel guilty for buying myself a simple treat. But that was my reality. I had trained myself to believe that every cent not given to my family was a form of neglect. Over time, subtle signs of resentment grew inside me. I felt uneasy about my family's constant reliance on me. Wasn't there a line between helping and enabling? But I'd never learned how to say no, especially to those I loved. So I kept my doubts silent and continued to shoulder every financial burden that came my way. My social life suffered. I rarely went out because I couldn't justify spending any money on having fun when my relatives always needed help. I'd see my coworkers sharing dinner plans, going to concerts, or planning weekend trips. Though I smiled on the outside, I often felt a pang of jealousy. I was in my early 20s, yet living like someone much older, every penny accounted for and earmarked for other people. Sometimes, friends would invite me out, offering to pay for my meal. I declined because I hated feeling like a charity case. My sense of self-worth was twisted. I was comfortable giving to my family, but despised the idea of receiving from others. It was an odd contradiction, but it defined my life. On the weekends, I often visited my parents. Each time, I'd leave with a lighter wallet. They claimed they had no food at home or the utilities were overdue. I'd open my banking app, transfer some funds, and offer a weak smile. This cycle became our normal routine. My parents saw nothing wrong with it, and I never complained, until a subtle sense of being used began to creep into my thoughts. The turning point arrived one gray morning when I was called into my boss's office. He informed me that the company was downsizing. Though I wasn't laid off, my hours were cut, and I'd lose several benefits, including a crucial transportation stipend. The pay cut wouldn't be devastating, but it was enough to cause alarm. As I walked back to my desk, my mind raced. How would I cover my own rent now, let alone keep providing for everyone else? My phone vibrated in my pocket. My sister was texting about an urgent situation involving her upcoming competition fees. She needed $500 before the end of the week. My heart sank. I mentally calculated the math and realized I didn't have $500 to spare. For the first time, I considered saying no and actually meaning it. The thought terrified me. I could imagine my sister calling me selfish or my mother scolding me for letting the family down. I tried to focus on my work, but my hands trembled over the keyboard. All I could picture was the looming confrontation if I finally refused to open my wallet. Yet a small, firm voice inside me insisted that I had no choice this time. That evening, I paced my tiny apartment, rehearsing what I'd say to my sister. Every time I picked up the phone, my nerves got the better of me. I didn't want her to hate me. I remembered how, as kids, she looked up to me, her eyes shining whenever I taught her something new. Now I feared she'd only see me as a source of money, or worse, an enemy if I refused. Eventually, I dialed her number. My voice shook as I explained that I couldn't cover her fees this time. Before I could even finish speaking, she lashed out. She accused me of forgetting where I came from, letting success go to my head, and being selfish. The words stabbed at me, each one heavier than the last. In the background, I heard my mother shouting something about all that money I supposedly have. I ended the call feeling both relieved and horrified. I had drawn a line, but the cost was immediate and brutal. My sister's harsh words replayed in my mind on a loop. Despite my guilt, a small part of me felt proud for finally standing up for myself, even if it meant becoming the villain in her eyes. I spent the next few days dodging texts and phone calls. My phone lit up relentlessly, each notification sending a wave of anxiety through me. My father left a voicemail saying he was disappointed and that the family was in dire straits. My mother sent long text messages, piling on guilt. Friends noticed I was more withdrawn at work, and I even lied, saying I was just sick. I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in my family was talking about me behind my back, branding me the ungrateful child. Memories flooded back. Birthdays I'd missed because I was too busy working, holidays overshadowed by money troubles, and all the times I'd rearranged my life to help them. None of that seemed to matter now that I'd said no once. At night, my chest felt tight, and I'd lie awake thinking about how everything had shifted so drastically. For the first time, I found myself truly alone. I had no intention of abandoning my family, but I realized our dynamic had been toxic for a long time. Part of me wanted to rush back in and fix things. Another part, the part that was finally showing some self-respect, told me to stand firm. That weekend, I woke up to a barrage of messages that pushed me past my limit. My mother had messaged, accusing me of being cruel. My father chimed in, reminding me of the sacrifices they made to raise me. My aunt called, implying I'd turned my back on the family's values. I felt cornered, and my anxiety skyrocketed. I sat at my kitchen table, a mug of cold tea beside me, my eyes filled with tears. I realized that for years I had placed my family's needs so far above my own that I barely recognized myself. The guilt was strangling me, but an undercurrent of anger also surfaced. I was furious at them for making me feel responsible for every financial hurdle, and I was furious at myself for allowing it. In that moment, I decided I needed help. I reached out to a coworker named Carla, who had once mentioned she struggled with setting boundaries with her own family. She invited me over, and we talked for hours. She listened without judgment, nodding sympathetically. Then, with a gentle squeeze of my hand, she told me something I'd never forget. Saying no isn't selfish. It's survival. Emboldened by Carla's words, I started looking into therapy. I found a sliding scale counselor who specialized in family dynamics. My hands shook as I filled out the intake forms. It felt like I was betraying my parents by even seeking outside help, but I knew I couldn't handle the emotional toll alone anymore. During my first session, the therapist asked me to recount the earliest moments I felt obligated to provide for my family. I described nights when my father would openly worry about bills in front of me, how my mother would cry about needing groceries when I was barely 9. Over the years, I learned to equate love with monetary support. Saying "I love you" meant stepping up financially. The therapist nodded gently and said, "It's not your job to fix everything." I'd never heard those words directed at me before. I cried uncontrollably, feeling a deep sense of relief and guilt warring inside me. After the session, as I walked home, a new feeling took root. The possibility that I was allowed to create a different kind of life. One where I wasn't weighed down by everyone else's financial emergencies. Bolstered by a few therapy sessions, I decided it was time to have a serious conversation with my parents. I drove out to the old neighborhood. My chest tight the entire way. When I arrived, the house looked more weathered than I remembered, the paint chipping around the windows. It made me feel both nostalgic and resentful. My mother answered the door, her expression stern. She didn't hug me, didn't even smile. I took a deep breath and asked if we could sit down. My father ambled in from the next room, arms crossed. Without any preamble, he asked, "What happened to you? Used to be so generous." I steeled my nerves. I calmly explained how my finances had changed, how I wasn't in a position to keep dishing out money, and most importantly, how this endless cycle was unhealthy for all of us. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She accused me of abandoning them. My father said I was selfish, that I only cared about my own comfort now. Despite their words, I refused to budge. I told them I loved them but wouldn't keep sacrificing myself. The tension felt like a suffocating blanket, but I was determined not to slip back into the old role. The following week was a roller coaster of emotions. My parents barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was laced with guilt-inducing lines. "Remember who changed your diapers? We always put you first, and you wouldn't have that job if it weren't for us." My sister joined in, giving me cold shoulder treatment when I tried to check on her. I took each hurtful phrase to my therapy sessions, dissecting them one by one. It wasn't easy to change the script running in my head, but the therapist helped me see that love isn't measured by how much you sacrifice financially. She said, "Sometimes enabling can feel like love, but it keeps everyone stuck." I clung to that sentence like a lifeline. At work, I tried to focus more, trying to rebuild my professional reputation. My supervisor noticed my renewed concentration and praised me for turning things around. I realized I could function better when I wasn't consumed by everyone else's issues. Still, the nights were hard. I'd stare at old photos of us smiling at barbecues and think, were those moments genuine, or were they just waiting to ask for money? The doubt was corrosive, but I held firm. I kept reminding myself why I'd said no. My extended family caught wind of the situation. A few relatives started reaching out, some sympathetic, some accusing me of airing dirty laundry. My aunt insisted that I had a moral duty to help my parents in their time of need. I countered by explaining I'd been doing that for years, and it was never enough. A surprising ally emerged, my cousin Maria. She admitted she too had been funding her parents, but on a smaller scale. Maria was proud to see me stand my ground. She confessed she felt trapped under similar expectations and wanted to learn how to assert herself. We bonded over the weight of being labeled the good kids, the responsible ones who never said no. Her support strengthened my resolve. I realized I wasn't the only one in the family stuck in a cycle of financial obligation. It was a pattern passed down, like an heirloom. Maria and I agreed that things needed to change for everyone's sake. With this newfound camaraderie, I felt less alone. I no longer saw myself as a traitor, but as someone trying to break an unhealthy family pattern. Even though the backlash was intense, I felt a spark of hope that I wasn't fighting this battle on my own. Work became a refuge. I dove into projects with enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years. My job performance improved, and people noticed. I was given more responsibilities and opportunities to shine. Bit by bit, my confidence returned. It was a revelation to see how much my emotional well-being influenced every aspect of my life, including my career. Yet, every silver lining came with a cloud of guilt. Whenever I got a bonus or a positive evaluation, a voice in my head whispered, "You should be sharing this with your family." But now, I challenged that voice. I reminded myself that supporting your family doesn't mean neglecting yourself. A conversation with Carla stood out. Over lunch, she congratulated me on a successful project. I confided that I worried my good fortune would tempt me to go back to old habits and just start handing out money again. She placed a comforting hand on my arm. "Your success is your own," she said. "It's okay to be proud and to keep your rewards. It doesn't make you selfish." Her words lingered. By choosing not to prop up everyone's financial crises, I was learning to stand on my own 2 feet. A part of me felt free. I decided to limit my contact with my immediate family for a while. They were upset, accusing me of ghosting them, but I needed the space. The daily barrage of guilt trips was taking a toll on my mental health. So, I limited my phone calls to once a week and set strict boundaries. No money talk unless it was truly life-threatening. This new rule didn't sit well with my parents, who insisted every situation was urgent. My mother would rattle off overdue bills, and my father complained about rising grocery costs. Each time, I calmly reminded them of my boundary. "I'm sorry you're going through this," I'd say, "but I can't fix it financially." I felt like a broken record, but I stayed consistent. Outside of those conversations, I started rediscovering simple joys. Reading a novel, going for a walk in the park, or treating myself to a decent meal at a local diner. These experiences felt new and liberating. I realized I'd spent so much of my life in a haze of work and worry that I forgot how to enjoy anything. Little by little, I reclaimed my life from the grip of financial responsibility I'd never asked for. A family gathering was set to take place for my grandmother's birthday. My therapist encouraged me to go, but only if I felt ready to handle the tension. After some thought, I decided to attend. I missed my grandmother's kind eyes, her warm hugs, and her unwavering support. She had always told me I deserved happiness, though she seldom interfered in family matters. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense. My parents avoided my gaze, and my sister barely spoke to me. A few cousins came up to offer casual greetings, but the undertone was clear. Everyone knew I was now the selfish one. Despite the discomfort, my grandmother's birthday was a joyful celebration. She smiled widely, grateful for every person who came. After dinner, I found a moment alone with her in the living room. She patted my hand and said quietly, "Don't let them make you feel bad. You did more than your part." Tears welled in my eyes and I hugged her. Her gentle reassurance felt like the warmth I'd been starving for. However, when I returned to the main room, I could almost feel the disapproving stares. I took a deep breath, remembering my grandmother's words, "You did more than your part." As the night wore on, my father finally approached me. He mumbled something about needing to talk, and I followed him to a corner of the room. He laid out a list of expenses, medical bills, overdue utilities, and a pending car loan. The total was staggering. My heart pounded as I braced for the inevitable request. "I thought about your little boundary," he said with a hint of sarcasm, "but we really need help. You can't just turn your back on us." The old sense of panic bubbled up, but I steadied myself. I gently explained I couldn't bail him out. I reminded him that I was focusing on my own finances, which had been neglected for too long. He exploded. His voice rose, drawing attention from nearby relatives. He accused me of being a traitor, claiming I had a duty to share my blessings. He stormed out, leaving me visibly shaking. My mother glared at me as though I'd committed an unforgivable sin. Despite the embarrassment and fear, I didn't chase after him. I felt a surge of clarity. I was done sacrificing my well-being just to placate others. I stayed for the rest of the party, but I left with a heavy heart, wondering if my family ties were irreparably damaged. Driving home, I replayed the confrontation in my head. Part of me wanted to pull over, call my father, and apologize just to restore peace. But I knew I couldn't keep betraying myself like that. Each time I caved, I undid all the progress I had made. The realization was sobering. Setting boundaries might mean not everyone will stay in my life, family included. I cried in the car, tears blurring my vision. All the tension, guilt, and sadness poured out of me. Yet beneath it all was a seed of resolve, a small certainty that I deserved a different path. By the time I reached home, I felt physically and emotionally drained. The next day, I woke up to numerous missed calls. Some were from family members telling me I should be ashamed. Others were from relatives urging me to make amends. I even had a voice message from a cousin saying my grandmother was disappointed in me, which I doubted given what she'd told me privately. I dragged myself to therapy, feeling broken. My therapist validated my pain and reminded me that boundary setting often feels worse before it gets better. "Your worth is not determined by your family's approval," she said. I tried to believe her. The following week, a new crisis erupted. My mother had an unexpected medical expense. She sent me scans of prescriptions and receipts, a voice note detailing how urgent it was. My immediate reaction was panic, mixed with frustration. I cared about her health, but I also knew if I covered these costs, I'd be back on the slippery slope of endless financial support. I checked my budget carefully. If I helped this time, I'd have to delay a crucial payment for my own therapy sessions. My stomach churned. I felt cornered, forced to choose between my mother's health and my own mental stability. I decided to meet her halfway. I researched local assistance programs, provided her with phone numbers and websites, and even found a nonprofit that could partially cover her medications. She wasn't pleased. In fact, she snapped at me, telling me I was cold-hearted for making her go through so much red tape. Yet, I refused to back down. I told her this was the best I could do, and that I hoped she understood. She hung up on me. The weight of her rejection felt like a boulder on my chest, but I clung to the notion that I was finally learning how to care for myself too. Days turned into weeks, and the silence from my family was deafening. I noticed I wasn't getting the usual stream of calls and texts demanding money. The emptiness was both relieving and painful. Sometimes, I'd scroll through old photos on social media, wondering if I was the one who had changed too much, or if they had simply refused to adapt. In therapy, I revealed I missed my family, despite the toxic history. My therapist said, "You can love them without letting them hurt you." Those words resonated deeply. It was possible to hold on to love while setting boundaries, but only if they respected those boundaries. Meanwhile, my life was improving in other ways. With fewer financial obligations, I managed to start a small savings account. I also began exploring a hobby I'd long abandoned, painting. I found solace in mixing colors on canvas, using art to channel the conflicting emotions swirling inside me. Though the distance from my family stung, the new sense of self-discovery felt liberating. I was learning how to exist outside of their constant needs, and that in itself was empowering. I felt like I was finally stepping into my own identity. An unexpected phone call came from my sister one afternoon. My heart raced as I answered, bracing for hostility. But her voice was subdued. She apologized for the earlier outburst, explaining she'd been under pressure with her dance competitions and felt abandoned when I said no. I listened carefully. I told her I understood it was hard, but I couldn't be the sole solution to every problem. She acknowledged that maybe she had been too reliant on me. It was the first time in ages I heard accountability from any family member. Though her apology was tinged with lingering frustration, it felt like a step in the right direction. We chatted for a while, tiptoeing around deeper issues, but at least managing a civil conversation. She shared updates about her training, I told her about my progress at work, and we agreed to talk more often, not just when money was involved. By the end of the call, I sensed a small bridge forming between us. When I hung up, I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps, if one family member could see my side, the others might come around too. Or, at the very least, we could rebuild some connection not centered on financial dependency. My sister's call gave me courage to reach out to my parents again. I dialed their number, and this time, my mother picked up. She sounded weary. I asked how she was feeling, and she hesitated before saying she was managing with the assistance program I'd recommended. I expressed genuine relief to hear she was getting the help she needed. She didn't apologize directly for her harsh words, but she didn't unleash any guilt trips either. We talked briefly about everyday things, her garden, a neighbor's new baby, and my father's job search. It was awkward, but civil. I sensed she wanted to bring up money again, but she seemed to hold back, perhaps aware of the boundary I'd set. After the call ended, I exhaled a shaky breath. Progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. The family's dynamic might never be normal, but maybe we could find a healthier middle ground. Still, I remained on guard. I knew that a single phone call didn't erase years of entrenched behavior. Yet for the first time, I felt like we were communicating without me being a financial crutch. It was a fragile piece, but I clung to it, determined not to revert to old habits. With time, I settled into a new routine. I focused on my job, my therapy sessions, and my personal growth. My savings account grew steadily, and I even allowed myself occasional treats, a new outfit, a decent restaurant meal, or art supplies. Each purchase felt like a quiet victory over the guilt that had once dictated every decision. Meanwhile, my family began to adjust, however reluctantly. They no longer bombarded me with financial demands. Instead, they found their own ways to cope or reached out to community resources. I found out my father took on a second job, and my mother started making crafts to sell online. My sister taught extra dance lessons to younger kids. While they still grumbled about hardships, they seemed to be surviving without my constant injections of cash. I noticed I was less anxious. My phone's ringtone no longer triggered a spike in my heart rate. I slept better, and my headaches subsided. It was as if I had finally severed the chain that kept me tethered to everyone else's drama. The emotional wounds still remained, of course. I missed the closeness we once shared, but I realized that closeness was largely built on my financial support. Now we were forging a different bond, one that might actually be real. Looking back, I realize how far I've come. I was once the family ATM, trapped in a cycle of guilt and obligation, terrified of the backlash if I dared to set limits. Now, I stand on firmer ground. My finances are stable, my mental health is in a better place, and I've discovered who I am beyond my role as provider. It hasn't been easy. My family still calls me selfish sometimes, especially when I decline a new request or remind them that I have my own financial goals. But their words no longer hold the same power they once did. I've learned that selfish can be a label people use when they're upset. You're no longer giving them what they want. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It just means I'm protecting my own well-being. I still hope for a future where we can have a warm, loving relationship free of hidden agendas. But for now, I'm proud of the boundaries I've set. I no longer shoulder the financial burdens of everyone in my family, and I refuse to feel guilty about it. Yes, I was the family ATM. Until I finally said no.